had the big ship that had the biggest guns. Now Bismarck was the fastest ship that never sailed the sea. On the decks were guns as big as spears and shells as big as trees. Out of the cold and foggy night came a British ship, the Hun. On the decks were guns as big as spears and shells as big as trees. Out of the cold and foggy night came a British ship, the Hun. On the decks were guns as big as spears and shells as big as trees. Out of the cold and foggy night came a British ship, the Hun. On the decks were guns as big as spears and shells as big as trees. Out of the cold and foggy night came a British ship, the Hun. On the decks were guns as big as spears and shells as big as trees. Out of the cold and foggy night came a British ship, the Hun. On the decks were guns as big as spears and shells as big as trees. Out of the cold. We gotta sink the Bismarck, was the battle sound. But when the smoke had cleared away, the mighty earth went down. For 6 long days and weary nights, they tried to find her trail. Churchill told the people, put every ship for sail. For somewhere on that ocean, I know she's gotta be. We gotta sink the Bismarck to the bottom of the sea. They find the German battleship that's making such a fuss. We gotta sink the Bismarck, 'cause the world depends on us. The decks are running, boys, and spin those guns around. When we find the Bismarck, we gotta cut her down. The fog was cold the 7th day, and they saw the morning sun. 10 hours away from homeland, the Bismarck made its run. The admiral of the British fleet said, turn those bows around. We found that German battleship, and we're gonna cut her down. The British guns were aimed and the shells were coming fast. The first shell hit the Bismarck, they knew she couldn't last. That mighty German battleship is just a memory. Sink the Bismarck was the battle cry that shook the 7 seas. We found the German battleship was making such a fuss. We had to sink the Bismarck, 'cause the world depends on us. We hit the deck for running and we spun those guns around. Yeah, we found the mighty Bismarck and we couldn't cut her down. We found the German battleship was making such a fuss. We had to sink the Bismarck, 'cause the world depends on us. We hit the deck for running and we spun those guns around. We found the mighty Bismarck and we cut her down.
All right, and welcome. I wrote something, so I'm going to start writing more and doing less off the cuff. And I'm going to start also proofreading and reading now prepared materials. Off the cuff is hard, and here we go. This is called the prisoner's dilemma. You might be familiar with this concept from economics, where non-cooperation is the optimal scenario. If all people don't cooperate with the captor, then they all get the optimal sentence. And I've adapted that to our current situation, and I'm citing historical context here. Okay. The prisoner's dilemma. Gripping the Russian people by the hair of their heads, the Bolshevik movement is and has been since its beginning guided and controlled by Russian Jews of the greasiest type. That's from an American military report debriefing Washington on the state of Russia in the early days of the Soviet. Russia had been taken captive, and its people became a prisoner to the culture subverters, as Yaki liked to call them. This is also true of our country today. We face a prisoner's dilemma. There are 3 scenarios. A. If one politician colluded with Jews and others don't. If one politician doesn't, let me fix that. If one politician doesn't collude with Jews and the others do, he is crushed. And the people who that politician would have represented get more Zionist-occupied government. Scenario B. If all politicians collude with the captors of this nation's institutions, none of the politicians get crushed as anti-Semites, and we get more Zionist-occupied government for the people. C. And this is the optimal scenario. if a majority of, or all politicians publicly state that they will not collude with the captors of this nation's institutions, the Jews, and that any politician who does is a traitor, the people will have a government that represents them, and the Jews will not be able to destroy all of these politicians. That's what I call running the trench. You can't do it alone. You need a bunch of people. And that's what I was hoping for in 2020 when we might still get it with Jew-naming politicians. Moving on. We are a captive nation, and as a people, we face this prisoner's dilemma. Much like in the classical economic prisoner's dilemma, where cooperation with the captor, the Jews, yields an advantage to those vying for power. Firstly, there is a matter of internal control of a country, which, when you cooperate with the international Jewry, winds up just being a front for Jewish interests. However, nominally, the man who the Jews back in power will enjoy certain privileges, and hence there is motive for selfish individuals within a country to seek power, nominally for themselves, which precludes those who wish to not cooperate with the international Jewry, those who want to put their nation, their people first, from coming to power. If there is a taboo on working with the Jews established in internal politics, the pursuit of power, as Yaki calls it, that could overcome the media and monetary advantages that the money printers can provide. Those looking to serve their people instead of international Jewry can portray the Jews as serving a foreign power in much a way as a colony has a foreign power prop up puppets when the colony seeks independence. If candidates that are backed by the Jews are completely unacceptable to the public, then the advantage of cooperation with the captor of the nation ceases to be an option, and the maximum gain under the prisoner's dilemma, scenario C, is realized. No parties working with the captor. Our optimal solution is obvious, for nobody to cooperate with the Jews, and our dilemma becomes one of figuring out how to dissuade people from collaborating with the Jews. And the founding fathers found a way to persuade people from not working with the British. They tarred and feathered them for treason. Anyhow, statesmen in the internal politics, or the pursuit of power that can result in maximum utility for all people, also face the prisoner's dilemma. If through internal politics, those who do not cooperate with the Jews come to power by one way or another, as has happened from time to time in the past, they will most likely pursue the interests of their people if they wish to remain in power without being propped up by the international culture subverters. Serving the interests of one's people involves both internal and external politics, and someone who comes to power to serve his people, as was the case of the man who came to power for his people in the European Revolution of 1933, will face the same headwinds internationally as does Iran today. Let us say, for example, that if President Taft had decided to pursue optimal strategy in the prisoner's dilemma in terms of foreign trade, how this might have looked. First, President Taft would have to have had determined if any foreign states were not cooperating with the international Jewry in pursuing their foreign trade. In other words, if he would not be the only one deciding not to take the captor's offer of advantage for not pursuing his respective countries in foreign trade, his respective countries' interests in foreign trade. He would not have to look far, for he would find the Russian Empire as a willing partner in trade not regulated by the international merchant middlemen of the self-proclaimed nation-state culture people race. That's what Yaki calls the Jews, by the way, who had already opted out of taking their captor's offer of advantage if their interests be served. This is actually what the case was when the representatives of the rootless clique proclaiming U.S. citizenship visited Taft in the White House and he dressed them down, refusing to restrict trade with the Tsar. Taft stated his good reason. It was fortuitous to the U.S. to have less trade restrictions placed upon wares imported from and exported to Russia. The U.S. was short on timber at the time, and Russia would have gladly provided such raw materials to the U.S. in exchange for industrial tools, weapons, and heavy machinery for its infrastructure projects. Both countries would have benefited from the near free trade agreement that Taft and the Tsar were advocating, and the average American, as well as the average Russian, would have been better off for the arrangement. However, Taft was unable to stand up to the Jewish onslaught and caved to the Jewish demands that the trade with Russia be restricted because the prisoner's dilemma of the internal politics of the U.S. had not been optimally solved. There was no taboo on receiving help from the Jewish bankers, no taboo associated with sucking up to the Jewish press. Hence, with Theodore Roosevelt cooperating with the Jews, the first ever third-party candidate to win a substantial share of the vote threatened to, and in the end did, sabotage Taft's re-election efforts. Hence, the prisoner's dilemma must be first considered with the internal politics before it can be considered in international politics. If all of the prisoners but a few scream out from behind their bars of the prison to the rest of the prisoners, "We shall not collaborate with our captors, and we shall all walk free for lack of testimony to imprison our peers," but Mr. X and Mr. Y have not publicly pledged not to sell out to the Jews. Therefore, we all know what to do tomorrow in the cafeteria. Mr. X and Mr. Y would be quick to reconsider their cooperation with and collaboration with the Jews, their subordination of the will to the captors. This is true for domestic as well as international politics as well. The captors need only be named. If enough candidates pledge not to serve the Jews in a country's policies, any candidate who does not pledge to serve the good, the will of the people, as Trump has refused to, will be booed off the stage until they agree to serve the will of the people. In international politics, for example, if Trump and Putin at a meeting in Tehran were suddenly and openly on live television to state that they have arrived at an agreement to never take Israel's interests into consideration before having dealings with foreign nations, then any country still doing so would have its population rise up against the puppets who rule over them in the employ of the international Jewry. And that is my adaptation of the prisoner's dilemma from economics to international politics and domestic politics. You cannot optimally solve the prisoner's dilemma, reach the optimal solution with maximum utility as it is in the chart in economics, if you look at a utility curve, unless you have all parties, through duress or through incentive, agreeing not to cooperate with the prisoners. Now, if you talk about the prisoner's dilemma, classically in economics, it's as follows. If one prisoner rats out the other, and the other doesn't rat the other up, the first one gets a plea deal and the second doesn't. And the first guy walks free and the second guy gets 10 years in prison. Now, if they both rat each other out, they both get plea deals, and they both serve 5 years. Or no, they both serve 8 years. Now, in the scenario where neither of them talk and neither of them cooperate with the captor, then they both walk free or get just a year in prison. That's the prisoner's dilemma in economics, and I've applied it here to politics with the Jews being the captor. And I'm tempted to read to you a conversation between Adolf Hitler and his mentor, Mr. Dietrich Eckart. Are any of you familiar with Dr. Dietrich Dietrich Eckart? He was the mentor for Adolf Hitler. All right, so let's see. So the prisoner's dilemma. Let's see. So I wish I had a Dietrich Eckart. When I woke up, I just went out and started naming the Jew and ran for office. I had only read a few books. I studied them for about 6 months before I became politically active, and then I was too busy to study them more. I wish I had studied the Jews more. So I'm going to look up now this thing, and I'm going to link it in the chat. This is a must-read for all of you. Here we go. I'm linking it to you in the chat now. You must read this. I just finished reading this. And, what the heck? Do I feel like reading it to you? It's 22 pages. You guys want me to read to you? It's a must read. Let's just go ahead and do it. I'm feeling it. Let's see. Okay, I'll read it to you. It's in the chat now. Actually, I'll edit the video to include it. So if you want to follow along with me, so if you'll refresh, it's now in the description of the video. Let's see, it should be there. I'll check to make sure it is. Yeah, I'm going to start getting some drops for when I'm doing stuff. I'll mute myself and just leave you like with some June naming I've done in the past as like a clip that's rolling as I search for stuff. Here we go. So back to it. Okay. Is this thing still going? And I'm getting ready to read it to you now. So here we go. I just dropped it. So it's in the description of the video now, and I've just placed it into the text, and I'm placing it again, and a third time. And a fourth time. There. So you can read along with me. Where's the darn thing? Oh no, that's Dietrich Eckart, Lenin. There we go. Okay. Bolshevism from Moses to Lenin, a dialogue between Adolf Hitler and myself. That's Dietrich Eckart referring to himself there reflexively. Translated by Dr. William Pierce. Wow, Pierce spoke German? I didn't know that. I do too. I should find his ghost and speak to him. Just a joke there. So the following material has been translated from a pamphlet found in the NSDAP Hauptarchiv. Its German title was Der Bolschewismus von Moses bis Lenin. Zweigespräch zwischen Adolf Hitler und mir. And it was originally published in Munich in March of 1924 from unfinished notes on which Dietrich Eckart had been working in the autumn of 1923. He died in 1923, by the way, shortly after being released from prison after the Munich Putsch. Dietrich Eckart was born on March 23, 1868 in the Bavarian town of Neumarkt, which is about 20 miles south of Nuremberg. And he died on December 26, 1923 in Berchtesgaden. He was a poet, a playwright, a journalist, scholar, and a philosopher, as well as a decided fighter for the National Socialist cause. Among his better-known works are his play Lorenzo, I don't know, that's Italian, and his translation and adaptation of the German stage of Ibsen's Peer Gynt. I don't know what that is. He was, for a while, editor of the Völkischer Beobachter, which is the People's Observer, which was an NSDAP pamphlet. And he wrote the NSDAP song with the famous words Deutschland erwache, which later became the NSDAP byword. The reader interested in more details of Eckart's life, as well as a fairly extensive sampling of his poetry, is referred to Alfred Rosenberg's book, Dietrich Eckart, Ein Vermächtnis, Munich, 1928. Der Bolschewismus is of interest to Americans today for three reasons. First, it is the last earthly work of the man who, as the intimate companion of Adolf Hitler during those critical early years in Munich, helped prepare the spiritual foundations of National Socialism. Eckart had been seriously ill as he was writing the pamphlet, and his arrest and temporary imprisonment as a consequence of the Putsch of November 9, 1923, were followed shortly by his death. Second, it is instructive as being representative of a certain category of propaganda. Eckart was a practical propagandist as well as an idealist and a poet, and Bolshevismus is an excellent example of his style. Aimed at the reader with the equivalent of a high school education, it is skillfully... and by the way, the White Nationalist Manifesto by the Countercurrents guy, what's his name? I forget his name. He also did this. He adapted it for a high school education, the style of writing. That's a good idea. That's how propaganda should be. Anyone who tries to say, "Oh, you have to wax poetically and use complex words," no, that's the opposite of propaganda. Uh, Second, it is instructive as being representative of a certain category of propaganda. Eckart was a practical propagandist as well as an idealist and a poet, and Der Bolschewismus is an excellent example of his style. Aimed at the reader with the equivalent of a high school education, it is skillfully contrived to avoid tediousness and maintain a relatively unsophisticated audience's interest while making a rather extensive, if not intensive, historical investigation of the Jewish question. It achieves this by relegating the great majority of documentary evidence to footnotes and by liberally inspecting historically significant points with spicy or amusing tidbits. Third, it is of considerable interest even today for its own sake, although the last 40 years have unfortunately provided us with considerably more experience of the Jewish Bolshevist activities. Eckart did quite well with the materials available to him in 1923. Of particular interest is his use of the Old Testament as a history of the Jews to throw light onto more recent Jewish activities. Eckart's notes for Der Bolschewismus were still in rather rough and unfinished form when he died, and this will be evident at a few places in the text which follows. The editor has slightly condensed the original material during his translation, omitting several of the more ragged portions and such things as untranslatable puns, as well as a few sections which have limited interest for present-day readers. Additional footnotes have been added by the editor in a few places, and these are so designated. By the way, Hitler was great at puns, and most of the German puns I know, Wortspiele, do not translate directly from English to German unless you point out the ambiguous meanings of the word, which puns aren't always easy in German because they do not have much ambiguity in the language. But moving on. And this is the beginning of a dialogue between Adolf Hitler and me, as translated by Dr. Pierce. "Yes," he cried. "We've been on the wrong track. Consider how an astronomer would handle a similar situation. Suppose that he has been carefully observing the motion of a certain group of celestial bodies over a long period of time. Examining his records, he suddenly notices something amiss. 'Damn it,' he says, 'something's wrong here. Normally these bodies would have to be situated differently relative to one another. Not this way. So there must be a hidden force somewhere which is responsible for the deviation.' And using his observations, he performs lengthy calculations and accurately computes the location of a planet which no eye has yet seen, but which is there all the same, as he has just proved. But what does the historian do, on the other hand? He explains an anomaly of the same type solely in terms of the conspicuous statesman of the time. It never occurs to him that there might be a hidden force which caused a certain turn of events, but it was there. Nevertheless, it had been there since the beginning of history. You know what that force is? The Jew." And there is no way to understand history unless you understand the Jews, or else you're just repeating a bunch of dates. You're just repeating a bunch of names and dates and battles' names. But unless you understand the Jews, going back even to ancient the city in Babylon, the city in ancient Samaria, nothing makes sense unless you know the Jews and the rabble-rousing they do. They are rats that gnaw out the guts of a civilization until it dies, and when another civilization comes across the dying civilization and conquers it, they inherit the Jewish infection. These rats traveled all over the world long before Europeans did, and they have been there embedded in almost all Western cultures long before any of our empires that we learned about in school ever traveled to these tribes, with the exceptions of the Germans and the Nords, which slaughtered Jews when they came across them, until they conquered Rome, and then inherited them with the infrastructure of Rome. It took the Jews about 1,000 years, by the way, to navigate their ways into the Germanic tribes, and that's why they want to exterminate Germans, because although Germanic people are so gullible to the Jewish lies because they're not evolved to be around liars like Jews, once the Germans wake up, or Nords wake up to Jewish lies, moral outrage is something that is especially strong in Europeans. But I think this is so brilliant, the way they described it as an invisible force acting as a physical force on another body that's celestial and observable. This is the way we discovered black holes. We had to explain the dancing of stars. There was some gravitational force we couldn't ascertain, and we had to infer that there was something there, and we later learned about black holes. So, think of Jews like the black holes. They're exerting a force, but they're not, up until recently we didn't know what they were. We just saw things behaving differently than they should. So the text goes on. You know what that force is? The Jew. Yeah. And then Dietrich replies, yes, certainly. I replied, but to prove it, for the last 50 or 100 years, so far as I'm concerned, it's been obvious, indeed, a good deal further back, perhaps even pre-Christian times. And this is the thing. When you wake up to the Jews, how do you go around and tell people about them? How do you make propaganda that tells people about the Jews where you don't come across as crazy? They had the same problem back then, and you're going to learn from this in plain layman's terms, and just how hard it was for the National Socialists to arrive at a way to tell people about the Jews without sounding crazy or too intellectual. And this is a problem that even Greg Johnson has had, where he tries to explain the Jews, but to do it you have to give a big history lesson. Hitler and Eckart were geniuses because they figured out how to tell the common man about the Jewish problem. And they're probably going to show with the stream because this gets spicy. Let's see, are we still going? Okay, yeah, it's still going. Okay. My dear fellow, Hitler replied to me, we can read in Strabo that already in his time, shortly after the birth of Christ, there was hardly a place to be found on the whole earth which was not then dominated by the Jews. So Strabo was a Roman historian. Dominated by the Jews. Dominated, he writes, not merely inhabited. Already decades earlier, Cicero was a famous Roman. Decades earlier, Cicero, at that time a great and powerful man, my friend, suddenly lost his nerve when, in his well-known defense plea in the Capitol, he was obliged to point out the great influence and the cohesiveness of the Jews. Softly, softly. I want none but the judges to hear me. The Jews have already gotten me into a fine mess, as they have many other gentlemen. I have no desire to furnish further grist for their mills. Basically approached the bench and told the judges, look, the Jews are fucking me over. Let's talk quietly. I'll tell you what's really going on. The Jews are attacking me. So that's the ancient Roman Cicero. He's a famous poet and anyhow, moving on. Similarly, the influence of the Jews with Augustus was so great that they completely intimidated Pontius Pilate, who, as a deputy of the Roman emperor, was certainly not a nobody. Thus he said, for God's sake, away with this sordid Jewish affair, as he reached for his wash basin and condemned Christ, whom he considered guiltless to death. John, and that's from the Bible, John 19:12. Considering these things, my friend, every child knows, or rather could know, how late the hour already was at that time. So back in Roman times, the Jews were already almost all-powerful, and they exerted pressure on the Roman Empire to execute Jesus, not because the Roman Empire wanted to kill him, it's because the Roman Empire, in the Senate, the Jews had the damn senators bought off, and they brought down anyone that gave them trouble, just like today in our capital. So as a reach for the Old Testament, a brief flipping of pages, and there, he cried, the recipe from which the Jews always brew their hellish broth. We anti-Semites are really something. We managed to find out everything except what is really important. Word for word, he emphatically read with a hard voice, and he's quoting from the Bible here, and I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. They shall fight, everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fall in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the consul thereof. And they shall seek to their idols, and to their charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. Isaiah. So this is Old Testament. Isaiah 19:2-3. So basically, we're going to subvert the Egyptians, and then we're going to be the soothsayers that tell them what to do when they're panicked. This is the Hegelian dialectic. Create a problem and then offer the solution when they're panicked. And yes, indeed, Hitler laughed bitterly. Quote, now the people will seek to Dr. Kuno and Dr. Schweyer and Dr. Heim and whatever other charmers and wizards they have. So he's saying in contemporary times, people are panicking. There's inflation in Weimar Germany. People are starving to death. And now they're turning to Jewish stage actors and to Jewish psychiatrists and all these other Jewish people that are then going to do Frankfurt Stool style shit where, the solution to your country's problems is to have homosexual pedophile plays and to prostitute your women out. When asked why Germany has become a pigsty, these gentlemen will always answer reproachfully, you yourselves are to blame. He's talking about the Jews. You have no more good breeding, no faith, only selfishness and conceit. Now you will try to put the blame on the Jews. It's always been like that when you have needed a scapegoat. Then everyone has jumped on the Jews and persecuted them unmercifully, and just because they had the money and because they were defenseless. Is it any wonder that a few individual Jews are behaving in a reprehensible manner now? After all, one finds some black sheep in every group, as if there weren't a good number of decent Jews. Look at their piety, their sense of family responsibility, their sober way of life, their readiness to make sacrifices, and above all, their ability to stick together. And you? At one another like dogs and cats. Sheer insanity. So he's talking about anytime shit starts going wrong in the country and people start pointing out that the Jews are behind the mayhem, the Jews always say, oh no, your country's in shambles because of you. Look at the Jews. Jews are good. So Hitler continues, thus will the charmers and the wizards prattle on, till one night the blood sign will appear on all the Jewish houses, and the infuriated masses led by the Jews will swarm forth to smite all of the firstborn in the land, as was in Egypt. Exodus 12:7-13, 29-30. Hitler goes on, remember how it was here in Munich during the communist takeover, I interjected. And Dietrich says, remember how it was here in Munich during the communist takeover, Dietrich interjected. I interjected. The houses of the Jews certainly weren't marked with blood, but there must have been a secret arrangement, because among all those who suffered the misfortune of a house search, not one was a Jew. As a matter of fact, one of the stupid red troopers who had me by the hair answered my sarcastic question by explaining that it was forbidden to search the Jewish houses. And Dietrich and Hitler, by the way, met in Munich, in Bavaria. I don't know if you knew this, but in 1919, Jews overthrew the government of the Free State of Bavaria. So Germany has Bundesländer and Freistädte, and Bavaria, because it used to be its own independent kingdom, has a special status of Free State. Jews took over, as was the plan during World War I. They took over during the chaos of the aftermath of the war. The Jews seized power of Bavaria. So whether or not you know it, there wasn't just a Red Revolution in Eastern Europe and in Russia. They successfully took over one of the biggest Bundesland of Germany, the biggest Freistaat. They took over Bavaria. And the veterans lined up all the Jews and shot them after that, but that's later on. And moving on. And in 1871 in Paris, the Jewish defense also ran according to plan. And I'm going to drop this into the text again. If you're just joining, we're reading a conversation between Hitler and Dietrich. I just dropped it in there 5 times. Enjoy that. 6 times. And in 1871 in Paris, the Jewish defense also ran according to plan. So they're talking about the run up to the Reign of Terror and the subversion of the French monarchy. There are communists. There the communists destroyed whatever they could, but the many places and houses of the Rothschilds remain completely intact. All this enables us to understand the place in Exodus, according to which a mixed multitude also left Egypt with the Jews. In Egypt, the scoundrel's scheme succeeded only about halfway, Hitler finished. The Egyptians became masters of the situation at the last moment and sent the mixed multitude to the devil, together with the Jews. There must have been a desperate struggle. The slaughter of the firstborn reveals that clearly enough. Just as they have done with us, the Jews had won the great lower stratum of the population for themselves. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Until one night they sent out the order, "Down with the bourgeoisie! Kill them, the dogs!" But things didn't turn out so well as they had expected. The portion of the Egyptian nation that had remained patriotic turned the tables and booted Moses, Cohen, and Levi out of the country, followed by the inhabitants whom they had incited. During this exodus, they carried along as much stolen booty as they could manage. The Bible reports with satisfaction. It also reports in no uncertain terms that the Egyptians were glad to be rid of them. Exodus 12:35 through 36, Psalms 105:38. The best, though, was the reward the Jews gave their stupid accomplices. Suddenly they began calling them a rabble. And there's a footnote for that in the Bible, whereas formerly they had called them comrade and pretended to love them. Imagine the faces these deluded ones must have made in the desert when they heard this. So the Jews told their useful idiots that helped them carry the plunder out of Egypt to fuck off in the middle of the desert. They probably starved to death. The murder of 75,000 Persians in the Book of Esther, no doubt, had the same Bolshevist background, I answered. The Jews certainly didn't accomplish that all by themselves. No more, Hitler confirmed, than the dreadful bloodbath over half the Roman Empire, which took place during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Hundreds of thousands of non-Jewish nobles in Babylonia, in Cyrenaica, in Egypt, and Cyprus, butchered like cattle, most of them after the most abominable torture. Footnote 6, that's from the Bible. And today the Jews still rejoice over that. If only the various centers of rebellion had cooperated, triumphs the Jew greats, then perhaps they would have already been able to give the Roman Colossus its death blow at the time. So there's a Jew saying that all the subversion the Jews were doing throughout the empire, if they had coordinated it, could have destroyed the Roman Empire in the first century ad domino. The Jews call our Sedan Day celebration barbarous, I remarked. Sedan Day is a celebration of a German victory over France in the war that was fought in, 1872, I think? 1870? Something like that. The Germans beat the French army and then returned to their original borders. The Jews call our Sedan Day a military celebration barbarous, I remarked, but they find entirely in order the fact that year in and year out, they still, after all this enormous time, celebrate in the synagogues the heroic deed concerning the 75,000 Persians in the Feast of Purim. None of this evidence seems to make any impression on us, however, he said dryly. One would think us deaf and blind. Before the first clash with the Egyptians, the head scoundrel, the modest Joseph, had pretty well prepared the 7 lean cows, all the granaries filled, the people raging with hunger, the reigning Pharaoh a perfect flunky of the Jews, and Joseph, with a corner on the grain supply, ruler over all the land, Genesis 41 through 43. All lamentations of the Egyptians were in vain. The Jew held the warehouses closed with an iron fist until they, in return for a bit of bread, were obliged to give away first their money, then their cattle, and their land, and finally their freedom. And suddenly the capital was swarming with Jews. Old Jacob was there, and his sons, and his sons' sons, and his sons' sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed. The entire hodgepodge, Genesis 46:7. And Joseph wept a good while for joy. Afterward he said to his brothers, "Ye shall eat the fat of the land, and the good of the land of all Egypt is yours." Genesis 45:18 and 20. But sometime after this glorious Egyptian citizen of the Jewish faith, 110 years old, had died. The old Pharaoh had passed away, and was succeeded by another Pharaoh, who knew not Joseph, and seeing the multitude of Jews, who meanwhile had grown very powerful, had become quite frightened. He feared lest, when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies. So the Pharaoh says, if we get attacked, the Jews are just going to help our enemies as they have in the past. Exodus 1:6 through 10. Thus he was smarter than Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who hoped for their support. The Jews must work, he decided. In all seriousness, work. Unmerciful, wailed the Jewish chronicler. No wonder they breathed vengeance. After all, for what did one have the Pöbelfolk if not to do the work? Pöbelfolk is what the Jews call Goyim. It's like they're Goyish workers. Basically, we're all their slaves, and they call us Pöbelfolk, which is like German and Yiddish slave workers, poor folk. By now, the Egyptians had forgotten dear Joseph, who was dead and gone, but there was also no lack of others on whom to blame the state of affairs, namely the landowners, the industrialists, the bourgeoisie. According to the Jews, no one else was responsible. Proletarians of all countries unite! And the masses believed it and turned on their own flesh and blood for the sake of the chosen people, who had brought on all of their distress in the first place. But to us they touchingly read aloud in school the beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers. No doubt many teachers wept a good while. It's enough to drive one to despair. Hitler paused with a dark look at the Book of Hate, and that's referring to the Old Testament. And so it goes. Through the entire Old Testament, Hitler began again. Indeed, I'm telling you nothing new, but we must bring it home to ourselves as often as possible in order to be able to negate the constant hypocritical babble. Really, the book of Joshua should suffice. Such a thing of uninterrupted genocide, of bestial cruelty, of shameless rapacity, and cold-blooded cunning, hell incarnate, and everything in the name of Jehovah, in fact, according to his express wish. When the city of Jericho fell to the Jews through their treachery of the harlot Rahab, neither man nor beast, neither young nor old, remained among the living. Only the harlot was spared. She and her whole noble family were rewarded with the privilege of living in Israel. Joshua 6:25. And what good-natured peoples they were, who, one after another, were completely exterminated. Delitzsch, a Jewish name, who has thoroughly investigated the period, writes, for example, about the Canaanites. On the hills under every shady tree they rendered adoration and reverence to the sun god and to the salutary goddess Asherah, and he compares this beautiful poetic custom with the pious ways of our Catholic villages, serving the Almighty in the remote mountain chapels. Joshua alone, I emphasized, was responsible for the massacre of 31 kings with all their people. Among those nations exterminated in these predatory raids were several who had yielded themselves trustingly to him. Each time the sinister words, "Let none survive," were heard. I am inclined to believe that the Pöbelfolk, the poor dumb Goyim, or at least their descendants, must still have been obedient shock troops of the Jews, not because the work was so atrocious, but because the children of Israel have always let deluded Gentiles do their dirty work, particularly when danger was involved. Besides, they would not have been strong enough to subdue the peoples to whom they were opposed without the bellicose enthusiasm of their brutalized comrades. So he's basically saying that communism is nothing new. The Jews always incite the lower stratum, the worker stratum, the peasants, against the elite of a country who would otherwise be ruling over them well, but the Jews cause problems, and then the Jews blame the elite that they wish to exterminate so they can take their place and rule with an iron fist over the Goyim. It's the same story, and it goes back thousands of years. That's what Hitler is saying, and that's what Dietrich is saying. Moving on. Of particular interest is the evident satisfaction with which the Jews have deliberately enumerated each of their slain kings. One is reminded of the prophet Isaiah. In one place he raves as if possessed. The Lord is angry at all the Gentiles. He will deliver them to the slaughter. Their land will become a burning pitch. It will become a wasteland soaked with their blood. There will be no nobles in the land. Their princes will die out. Isaiah 34. Between Isaiah and Joshua were hundreds of years, but in that whole time, the infernal rage of the Jews against the non-Jewish royalty hasn't changed a bit. And this is what Jews do. They come in, figure out who's in charge, get the common man of the they cause problems between the king and the people, and they get the people to kill the king, and then they enslave the people. That is what Jews have always done. They are predators and parasites. Moving on. And in all eternity, nothing will change, Hitler proceeded, so far as the attitude of the Jews toward our kings and our leaders is concerned. To destroy them is their eternal sin, and when they can't accomplish this by force, then they will use cunning. Whenever we have a strong leadership, the Jews are obliged to keep their noses clean. Our leadership can be truly strong, however, only if it is based completely on our people, only if it concerns itself with the welfare of the least among them, just as much as with that of the wealthiest of them, only if, in the firm conviction of its own worth, it bars every alien influence from the beginning, only if it is not merely national but also social, down to its very bones. No matter what others may say, I assert this: a time will come when all the elite nations of the world will have such a leadership. Jawohl! And then everyone will be astonished to see that instead of grating on one another, as has previously been the case, they will treat one another with respect and consideration. This is my vision too. For then there will be no more whipping up the land greed, of an itching for power, of suspicion, sentiments which exist in unmixed form only in the isolated few, and not in the more trusting general populace anyhow. There will be an end to the lying praise of an indiscriminate human brotherhood, which would be possible, if at all, only under the supposition that one had from the first excluded the eternal mischief-maker, the Jew. But had this been done, there would be no need to push the universal brotherhood idea. The various peoples would find themselves compatible of their own accord. Tell me, I interrupted him, strictly speaking, do you consider the Jew to be national or international? Neither, was Hitler's answer. One who really feels international has as much regard for the rest of the world as he does for his own nation. Were our so-called international swarms really like that, then fine. But I fear that they are secretly more concerned with the attitude of the rest of the world towards themselves than with their own attitude toward the world. Internationalism requires basically good intentions, but the Jew fundamentally and completely lacks these. He hasn't the remotest idea of classifying himself with the rest of humanity. His aim is to dominate others in order to extort from them at his leisure. Were he really interested in comradeship, he has had the longest and most abundant opportunity for it. Jehovah's command to him to make no alliances with foreign peoples, but, on the contrary, to devour one after the other, went straight to his heart. Exodus 34:12, Deuteronomy 7:16. Everywhere one greeted him with cordiality. At first, in ancient Egypt, in Persia, in Babylonia, in Europe, the cloven hoof appeared everywhere. The early Germanic conquerors found him with a number of arrogated rights and made no move to dispossess him of these. He was allowed to do business wherever and however he wanted, even in the slave trade, toward which he has always been peculiarly inclined. Peculiarly inclined. Like everyone else, he could hold public office, including the magistracy, and his so-called religion was protected by the state. Thus wrote Otto Hauser, who was an excellent source of fascinating illuminations regarding the Jew. I should say so, I nodded. One must partake of him with caution, though, otherwise one may not see the black forest for the blonde trees. On the whole, I prefer Werner Sombart, even though his Berlin lectures swarm with Jews. So Sombart's some type of lecturer from Berlin. I think I've read some of his stuff before, I can't remember. Now he says the same thing, Hitler cried. According to him, the Jews were by no means always second-class citizens. In antiquity, one even found them often with special privileges which absolved them from certain duties, such as military service. It was never their strong side to risk armed conflict. In the War of Liberation, the Jews of Deutschkrone in Pomerania sent a petition to the king requesting permission to remain home from the campaign in return for money. In this petition, they argued that 10,000 thalers, which is the unit of currency there, would be of much more use to the war effort than the frankly questionable fighting ability of the Jew. The petition was accepted not only from them, but also from the Jews of 5 more of the 7 Prussian districts. Yes, I know the place in Hauser, I added. It is authentic. He quotes there from Meyer's Encyclopedia, however, a statement which calmly claims that Jews, through their heroic spirit in the War of Liberation, proved themselves as worthy Germans. So it's the Jew talking out both sides of their ass, the thing they're quoting, where the Jew in one chapter admits that the Jews bribed the king not to draft them into the army, and in at the other side of his mouth in another chapter, the Jew was also saying, oh, they were heroic fighters in the war for Prussia. Moving on. Just as they did in the World Wars, referring to World War I, this is 1923. Hitler winked expressively. If I had my way, I'd require placards to be hung in all the schools, at every street corner, in every public room, on which would be printed nothing but Schopenhauer's description of the Jews. Great masters of the lie. There is no better description, and it applies without exception to every Jew equally, whether high or low, stock exchange tycoon or rabbi, baptized or circumcised, are servile people, provoked for thousands of years, and the innocents are taken in, again and again, by this blatant swindle. It is understandable that they become surly with the Jews, but only after the latter have shamelessly abused their naive good nature and plundered them to the skin with their usury and their fraud. And that has been the case everywhere, in the old Roman Empire, in Egypt, in Asia, later in England, Italy, France, Poland, Holland, Germany, and even, as Sombart writes, in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Jews have experienced so many blessings. And the game they're playing today, they have been at for 2,000 years. And by the way, by my research, it's more like 4,000. But moving on, Hitler continued, I think that suffices to characterize the nature of the Jewish internationalism. Now we shall... So the original question that Hitler's answering is, do you consider Jews national or international? And Hitler's saying neither, they're parasites. Now we still have left to consider the national feeling of the Jews. So he's already dismissed Jews as not... You couldn't call them international because they don't have the goodwill to be international. So now he's going to say why they're not national. Naturally... So now we have left to consider the national feeling of the Jews, naturally not that of one for Germany or the other for England and so on. Not many mice are to be caught with that bait any longer. Send me a box full of German soil so that I can at least symbolically defile the accursed country, wrote this so-called German Jew. Birne and Heinrich Heine sniffed out Germany's future from a toilet bowl. So he's saying these are 2 examples of Jews during World War I just shitting on Germany with illustrative language. The physicist Einstein, whom the Jewish publicity agents celebrate as a second Kepler. Kepler was the one who did, I believe he was the one that proved the elliptical orbits of the planets. Einstein, whom the Jewish publicity agents celebrate as a second Kepler, explained he would have nothing to do with the German nationalism. He is considered deceitful, the custom of the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith of concerning themselves only with the religious interest of the Jews and not their racial community also. So Einstein was pissed that the German Jews only discussed religious things publicly instead of racial things. Einstein thought they were powerful enough to talk about their racial interests at that time. A rare bird? No. Only one who believed his people already safely in control and thus considered it no longer necessary to keep up pretenses. In the Central Association itself, the mask has already fallen. A Dr. Brünn frankly admitted that the Jews could have no German national spirit. We always mistake their unprincipled Let me zoom in a little bit. There we go. We always mistake their unprincipled exertions to accommodate themselves to all and everyone for impulses of the heart. Whenever they see an advantage to be gained by adopting a certain pose, they never hesitate, and certainly wouldn't let ethical considerations stand in the way. How many Galician Jews have first become Germans, then Englishmen, and finally Americans? He's talking about how the Jews will say they're one nationality to get to the next country, assume that nationality, and before you know it, they made it in under the German quota to get into America. Henry Ford wrote about this extensively. Moving on. And every time, in the twinkling of an eye, talking about how quickly Jews snap their fingers, they twinkle their eye, and suddenly they're a new nationality. With starting rapidity, they change their nationality back and forth. With startling rapidity, they change their nationality back and forth. And whenever their feet touch, there resounds either the Watch on the Rhine or the Marseillaise or the Yankee Doodle. These are different nationalistic songs, depending on which country they're in. This is like your, what's that kike's name? Ben Shapiro. Just like, he's a super patriot, you know. Oh my God, I'm so pro-American. Now send more aid to Israel. Dr. Heim does not once question the fact of our Warburgs. Warburgs are very rich bankers from that time. Our Bleichroders, I guess they're bankers too, and Mendelssohns, very rich Jewish bankers, are able to... Okay, so Dr. Heim does not once question the fact that our Warburgs, our Bleichroders, our Mendelssohns are able to transfer their patriotism as well as their residents of today to London or New York or the morrow. On the sands of Brandenburg, an Asiatic horde, Walter Rathenau once blurted about the Berlin Jews. He forgot to add that the same horde is on the Isar, the Elbe, the Main, the Thames, the Seine, the Hudson, the Neva, and the Volga. All of them with the same deceit toward their neighbors. Our charmers and wizards, however, distinguish between respectable and not so respectable, between settled and newly imagined, between Western and Eastern Jews, and if worse comes to worse, they shrug their shoulders and mutter, every country has the Jews it deserves. It means nothing to them that it was a Jew who coined this fine-sounding phrase, nor that in the case of Germany, considering the quality of the Jews we have deserved, it becomes a resounding slap in the face. All Israel stands openly in the British camp, announced the American Union leader Samuel Gompers in 1916. And that includes the German Jews, too, as the American Ford well knew. So Hitler is quoting extensively from Henry Ford's The International Jew, which he read like his Bible in 1922. He has written of the faithlessness of the so-called German Jews toward the country where they live, and the fact that they have united themselves with the rest of the world's Jews towards the ruin of Germany. Why, jeers the Jew? Because the German is a vulgar scoundrel, backward medieval creature who hasn't the faintest idea of our worth, and we should help such rabble? No, he has the Jews he deserves. Such arrogance is indeed staggering to behold. I reminded him of Russia. Before the revolution, the Jews condemned her as a downright sewer of vileness, even though they were the evident vermin in that sewer. And now the same Jews are at the helm, and whoop, the same Russia is a great nation. In the year 1870, he rejoiced, we Germans had the privilege of being a great people. The Jews considered that the time had arrived for replacing the French emperor who had become undependable with a pliable president. This also seemed an excellent opportunity to establish the commune, which that is in the footnote 21. Thus the heroic German people. No wonder that the right behind our princes and generals, a pack of gesticulating Jews and financiers, rode into Paris. So he's saying that it was fortuitous of the Jews to back the Germans at that point because the Emperor Napoleon, was it Napoleon III? Yeah, Napoleon III was no longer cooperating with the Jews. So they backed the Germans to quickly conquer Paris so they could transform the government of Paris to a Jew-conforming fucking government. These fucking kikes never change. So Hitler's pointing out that even when they won, they were being used by the Jews. Meanwhile, though, we have sunk back down into the pack again. The press, that select tool of the Antichrists, as Bismarck called it, he's talking about Otto von Bismarck, who united Germany in the 1870s, as Bismarck called it, has designated us as the Boches and the Huns. But have patience, the more quickly we approach Bolshevism, the more glorious we will become again, and one fine day it will be the English and the French who are the scoundrels. One doesn't need to speculate to see that. I am a British subject, first and foremost a Jew, screamed a Hebrew years ago in a large English Jewish newspaper, footnote 22. And another, whoever has to choose between his duties as an Englishman and as a Jew must choose the latter. Footnote 23, that's a quote from a Jew. And a third, Jews who want to be both patriotic Englishmen and good Jews are simply living lies. That's a quote from a Jew, footnote 24. That they could venture things of that sort so openly indicates how overrun with Jews England already was then. The stronghold of European Jewry had its origin in the period between Cromwell and Edward VII, I emphasized. Since then, however, the center of Jewish activity seems to have been transferred to America. They have had a good footing there for a long time. Sombart maintains that it was Jewish money which made the first voyages of Columbus possible. Footnote 25. A Jew, Louis de Torres, is supposed to have been the first European to step on American soil, and topping everything else, the Jews have recently claimed Columbus as one of them. That's not surprising, Hitler laughed. Everyone who has somehow played a role in the world, the dear Lord included, is a Jew. Footnote 26. They even have Goethe and Schopenhauer on their list, and blessed be he who believes it. For my part, I contest them Columbus as well as Torres. Ocean travel was much more hazardous then than now, so Hitler's saying that the Jews are not going to take risks like that. The Jews like to go someplace that's established and safe. They don't like to take risks with pioneers. According to Hauser, I replied, Columbus was an Aryan, perhaps even of German descent. It's all the same to me, Hitler responded. As far as I'm concerned, he could have been a Zulu. I'd sooner attribute his deed to a Negro than to a Jew. Boom! Hitler had it out of the park there. Focus on the Jews. Don't worry about other races. Okay. And it goes on. Completely aside from that, it's clear that they have had America by the throat for quite a while, I continued. No country, writes Sombart, displays more of a Jewish character than the United States. 27. By the way, you should read Francis Parker, Yaquis Imperium. It talks about how the United States, being a colony of Europe as opposed to a historic European country, was especially vulnerable to the kikes. You should read Yaquis Imperium, but forgive his lack of understanding of genetics. Moving on. We have already seen a consequence of this in the World War. In 1915, at a time when the true Americans hadn't the slightest thought of a war against us, and in fact were so disposed toward us that any indication of a possible conflict of interest could have been smoothly and amicably settled, a secret advisory committee met with President Wilson for the sole purpose of preparing the country for a war against Germany. And that's footnote 28. And by the way, I can attest to this. Wilson ran on the platform of no getting into the war. And then he was working for the Jews the whole fucking time, and he got us right into the war. And who was the chief wire puller in these nefarious affairs which were set in motion a full 2 years before the engagement of the United States in the war? The previously unknown Jew, Bernard Baruch. I believe the war would come. Long before it came, Baruch later calmly explained to a special committee of Congress which had confirmed all this, and no one got up and beat the crafty scoundrel to a pulp. So, the Congress called this Jew the hearing after World War I because he robbed the fucking country blind when he was in charge of the economy under Wilson. And they were like, hey, did you intentionally get us into this war? And he's like, well, I saw the war coming a long time before we got into it. Not, he admitted to the Congress that the Jews dragged the fucking country into the war through trickery. Moving on. And Hitler saying, I can't believe the Congress didn't get up and just beat him to a bloody pulp. Moving on. The resolution of the Jewish High Command many years ago. It was the resolution of the Jewish High Command many years ago to unleash the World War is well authenticated, Hitler said. At the Sixth Zionist Congress in Basel in 1903, the president, Max Nordau, proclaimed, Herzl knows that we stand before a tremendous upheaval of the whole world. Footnote 29. Good old Herzl. What an idealist. Our charmers and wizards were filled with awe at the thought of this noble patriarch. The scoundrel knew, however, what his filthy people had in mind for us. By the way, World War I almost completely destroyed Europe, and World War II completely destroyed Europe in terms of being a world power, any of the member nations. Moving on. But Herzl was a Zionist, I interjected. He was a Jew, Hitler said, striking the table with his fist. The word Jew says everything. There is no need for any further distinction. God's chosen people want to have their own God's country again. Catch that again. God's people and God's country, neither of which in reality ever existed. Every portrayal ridicules for its depravity that general state of affairs which existed for some 600 years in Palestine until the Assyrians put an end to the mischief. Can you call that a country? Can one accept the Old Testament as the authority on the matter? First, we read of the uninterrupted murders and plunderings of other peoples of Palestine, which naturally took many years. Then, right up to the last, the most abominable vileness, one state of anarchy followed another. The pinnacle, the flowering, the glory of the Jewish statesmanship, namely King David, was such a rascal that even the unprecedented villainy of the letter condemning Uriah was not enough for him. On the deathbed, he urged his son to murder his old war comrade Joab. Quote, when Cyrus gave the Jews permission to return to Palestine from their Babylonian captivity, the overwhelming majority ignored Zion and remained in the immensely rich Babylonia. Completely content there, they continued their financial speculations and other activities. In the year 1267, I informed him, there were only 2 Jewish residents in Jerusalem. Up to the World War, the number of Jews in all Palestine had grown to only 12,000, footnote 30, even though they had been free to return there since ancient times and certainly weren't lacking travel expenses. The remaining 20 or so millions, exactly how many is difficult to ascertain since the Jews themselves do the counting, fatten themselves upon the sweat of others all over the world. It is hard to understand how tiny Palestine can hope to accommodate this enormous crowd. I'm just going to make sure this is still going. Okay. Okay, yeah, it's still going. I'm going to leave you with another song. I will be back. I'm taking a break because my throat's starting to rip. I'll be back in about 5 minutes.
Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We looked down the river and we seen the British come and there must have been 100 of them beating on the drum. They stepped so high and they made the bugles ring. We stood beside our cotton bales, didn't say a thing. We fired our guns and the British kept coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Old Hickory said we could take them by surprise. If we didn't fire muskets till we looked them in the eye. We held our fire till we see their faces well. Then we opened up the squirrel guns and really take them well. We fired our guns and the British kept coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, they ran through the rivers and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them. Down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We fired our cannon till the barrel melted down. So we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled his head with cannonballs and powdered his behind. And when we touched the powder off, the gator lost his mind. We fired our guns and the British kept coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, they ran through the rivers and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them. On down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
All right, I'm coming. Okay. All right. Moving on. This is Bolshevism from Moses to Lenin. In the year 1267, I informed him. Oh yeah, we already did that one. Yeah, we left off. Fatten themselves upon the sweat of the others of the world. It's hard to understand how tiny Palestine can hope to accommodate this enormous crowd. That's not necessary, Hitler retorted. The point is that it is now official. Israel has remembered itself. Its chains are cast aside. The son of a new God state will rises over Zion. What an act! Finally liberated from bondage. Everyone is numbered with awe. The Jews grin. They have already issued a resolution, I wanted to continue. Yes, indeed, Hitler cried. If anywhere. This is where the cat jumps out of the bag. The resolution of the Pan-Jewish Conference of 1919 in Philadelphia. The Jews are the citizens of the new Jewish state of Palestine, but at the same time they have the complete rights of citizenship of whatever country they choose to live in. One must read that non plus ultra of arrogance twice, indeed 100 times, in order to be sure one isn't dreaming. Imagine instead, the English are citizens of Great Britain. Each Englishman who chooses to live in Germany or France or Italy retains all his rights of English citizenship, but at the same time he has the complete rights of citizenship of the country in which he is living. Now ask yourself, what a scream of indignation not we or the French or the Italians, but the Jews themselves would raise if the English people had actually made such a resolution. The Pan-Jewish Congress, however, issued its resolution as categorically as a command. This assembly comprised representatives of all Jews of the world, including the Zionists. Their intentions were, in short, that the Jews should stay where they were and that the new Zion should simply have the purpose, first, to strengthen their political backbone, second, to gratify their arrogance, and last, but most important, to provide them a state where they could carry on their dirty business without fear of detection. I think we can form a pretty good idea of what Jewish nationalism from this is. Okay, so they are neither national nor international, I acknowledged. What then? In terms of our customary concepts, he shrugged, it really can't be defined. It is a rank growth over the whole earth, sometimes advancing slowly, sometimes leaping ahead in great bounds. Everywhere it sucks voraciously at the lifeblood of the planet. What was in the beginning a swollen abundance will become in the end nothing but a dried up sap. Zionism, the visible surface aspect. It is connected underground to the rest of the monstrous growth. And nowhere is there to be found a trace of opposition to this thing. One might say, I laughed, that the wolves have split themselves into two packs. It has been agreed that one of these shall abandon the land of the sheep in order to go live somewhere quite among themselves as pure vegetarians. There is one thing above all of which we must always keep in mind, Hitler tendered. One thing of which we must always remind ourselves. Great masters of the lie. One need only forget Schopenhauer's words for an instant in order to begin slipping under the influence of their deceptions. To be sure, we also lie, but in the first place, not as a matter of habit, and in the second place, clumsily. Any really experienced judge of human nature is able to detect the lie of an Aryan, even a very shrewd one. Sherlock Holmes himself, however, would be at a loss when confronted with the Jewish cold-bloodedness and deception. A Jew is only embarrassed when he inadvertently blurts out the truth. If he should happen to deliberately tell the truth, it is always with a mental reservation, thus making a lie even of the truth. Indeed, Luther, I replied, said to the Jews, you are not German, but a deceiver, not a Frenchman, but a faker. Footnote 31. His synonym for Jew was liar. That's what everyone who knows them says of them, Hitler rejoined. From the Pharaohs up to the Goethe and our time. It has been said in every dead and living language, in Greek, Latin, Persian, Turkish, English, French, and what have you. One would hope that these universal condemnations throughout the whole world would give our charmers and wizards at least a little to think about. God forbid, not even Christ was able to reach them. He stood there among the cringing Jewish rabble, his eyes flashing, the very image of scorn, and his words fell among them like whiplashes. Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh his own word, for he is a liar and the father of the lie. John 8:44. But to our charmers and wizards, that means no more than unintelligible stammering of a child. They delude themselves by believing that to be only a stern but well-meaning lecture of the Lord to his beloved people of Israel. I underscored his irony. Christ, he continued with a raised voice, was never other than perfectly straightforward and frank God. Not to feel the fact that their two fundamentally different worlds opposed one another. In Palestine, after the Babylonian captivity, there was a great lower stratum of non-Jews ruled over by Jewish moneylenders, powerful through their usury. One can read that in the book of Nehemiah. Sombart says that it leaves absolutely nothing to be desired in the way of clarity. Footnote 32. The outstanding point is that the real population, composed of oppressed peasants, was an entirely different race than the Hebrews. Gradually the Jews forced their religion on them. Christ himself growled about that. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye encompass sea and land to make one proselyte. Matthew 23:15. To the Jews, Galilee was a land of the Gentiles whose population sat in darkness as they impudently imagined. Matthew 4:15-16. They said, Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Art thou also of Galilee? Search and look for it, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. John 1:46-7:52. The Hebrews were so firmly convinced of the non-Jewish ancestry of Christ that they counted him among the especially hated Samaritans. John 7:48. We live and learn. There are many more such examples. So in other words, they're saying Jesus was not Jewish-blooded, but a Samaritan, which was Goyish, Gentile. One could hardly recommend a better policy than that which lets each man find salvation in his own fashion, I stressed. So he believed in freedom of religion. The tacit assumption in that policy, though, is that each man's fashion should involve some sort of decent sentiment, some genuine belief, and not a contemptible Phariseeism. This distinction should have been expressly emphasized long ago. It wasn't, and the religion of the moneylender and money changer has received the benefit of this misguided tolerance. Christ was not so tolerant. With the whip he put a stop to the business of the children of the devil, even though he had said, love your enemy. Yes, Hitler replied, but we must understand what Christ meant by enemy. We can love an honorable and decent enemy, even a brutal one, who is frank and forthright in his enmity, and at the same time we can beware of him. But Christ never dreamed that we should love men whom no love whatever could dissuade from their implacable determination to poison us, body and soul. Indeed, he himself did not do that. On the contrary, he continued to strike with his whip as hard as he could, and the words that he flung with indignation into the faces of the rabble breathed of irreconcilability itself. To me, he acted very proudly in the founding of his religion. There was very little contradiction between his sermons and his deeds. Why, then, have the pious never followed his example? They least of all. They mercilessly persecute even their decent adversaries. As a matter of fact, only their decent adversaries. Their eyes remain closed to the most cunning bunch of swindlers in existence. The Bavarian People's Party, for instance, knows quite well that we are defending the Christian foundations of our nation without mental reservations. They also know, however, that we can make no common cause with them so long as they adhere to their present policies. And so they turned to the Jews, hoping to remain in power with their help. They surprised themselves, dripping with friendliness at first. The Jews turned on them murderously when they had gotten to the upper hand. And he's talking about the Bolshevik taking over Bavaria. That was inevitable, I agreed with him. Fortunately, the Jews would not be able to provide us with the same sort of dreadful experience, for we do not betray and murder our own flesh and blood for the sales of profit. So far as we are concerned, the Bavarian People's Party could even remain in office, provided they clean the manure out of the pigsty. and perceive the correctness of our views. We are not willing to tear ourselves apart just for power, but we want Germanism, we want genuine Christianity, we want order and propriety, and we want these things so firmly established that our children and grandchildren can remain satisfied with them. They considered that impossible, he said, and therefore they consider our program nothing but empty phrases, of no more sincerity than the empty phrases which they had consciously tried to peddle themselves to the people. But our goals are not only possible, they are certain, even if we don't attain them tomorrow. But first a beginning must be made. So far, never and nowhere has there been truly a social state. Everywhere and always the upper crust has leaned much more strongly to the principle, what is yours is mine, than to what is mine is yours. The wise ones have only themselves to blame for the fact that the lower stratum, full of rage, now is committing the same error. The Jew is able to take advantage of both these groups. One of them provides for his affairs, the other one carries them out. Therefore we oppose them both. We will put an end to the unfair privileges as well as to slavery. Decidedly, I replied. Our front stands against both left and right, a strange situation. From two directions we must ward off attackers who also fight one another. The Reds scream at us as reactionaries, and to the reactionaries we are Bolsheviks. From both sides the Jew directs the attack on us. The lower stratum doesn't see him yet, thus hates us from sheer stupidity. The upper stratum sees him but thinks it can serve its own selfish purposes with him, and thus shoots us in the back from unscrupulousness than stupidity. More from unscrupulousness than stupidity. One really needs a good deal of faith under such circumstances in order to maintain one's courage. Which we have, God be thanked, in 100 ways, he said, laughing as he stretched himself. No words were spoken more directly to our hearts than, "Be not afraid," Matthew 28:10. And that was supposed to have been said by a Jew, these creatures of eternal fear, crazy. Every time new and promising opportunities for meddling have arisen, Hitler brought on, the Jew has been immediately involved. He has demonstrated an uncanny ability to sniff out, like a bloodhound, anything which was dangerous to him. Having found it, he uses all his cunning to get at it, to divert it, to change its nature, or at least to deflect its point from its goal. Schopenhauer called the Jew the dregs of mankind, a beast, a great master of the lie. How does the Jew respond? He establishes a Schopenhauer Society, likewise the Kant Society, in his work, in spite of the fact that, or rather because Kant summarily declared the Jewish people to be a nation of swindlers, footnote 33. The same with the Goethe Society. We tolerate no Jews among us, said Goethe. Their religion permits them to rob non-Jews, he wrote. This crafty race has one great principle. As long as order prevails, there is nothing to be gained, he continued. He categorically emphasized, I refrain from all cooperation with the Jews and their accomplices, footnote 34. And that's Goethe. All in vain. The Jewish-controlled Goethe Society is still there. It would be there even if he himself had expressly forbidden such knavery. Fucking kikes. Jesus Christ. With exactly the same right, I interjected, the two of us could join the Talmud Society. What impudence that would require. Inconceivable. Impudence is pretty much just chutzpah, psychopathic levels of audacity. Not to the Jew, he replied. To him, impudence has no meaning. He is only able to think in terms of advantage or disadvantage, profit or loss. One must approach him with a different sort of measuring stick, meaning the Jews are of a different mindset. You have to realize that whites and Jews think very differently. Our charmers and wizards, I rejoined, all fall for their trick. Goethe, Kant, Schopenhauer seem to be nothing but babblers to them. Bah! Goethe, he interrupted contemptuously. Not even the saintly Thomas Aquinas is able to reach these people. The great father of the church has described in his writings our relationship with the Jews in terms of a voyage of a ship. The Jews, embarked on the same vessel with the Christians, play a characteristic role. While the Christians are occupied with sailing the ship, the Jews plunder the storeroom and bore holes in the hull. St. Thomas recommends that they should be relieved of their booty and chained to the rudder. What an atrocity! How unchristian! Poor Jews! One can learn so much from them, at least according to Doctors Heim and Schwer. And so the world goes on, governed with the same wisdom as the time of Joseph's Pharaoh. Namely by statesmen, I completed. who are so busy rustling, namely by statesmen, I completed, who are so busy ruling that they completely fail to notice that not they but others actually rule, by men like Tsar Nicholas, who indulged himself in the same self-deception and got a bullet in the head for it. As early as 1843, Disraeli gave us a hint of what we should expect there. The mysterious Russian diplomacy is organized by Jews, he boasted. Also, the mighty revolution which is in the making in Germany is evolving entirely under the leadership of Jews. Footnote 35. Most of our revolutions, he said, whether initially with desirable goals or not, have evolved under Jewish leadership. The revolutions of vulgar predisposition were, for the most part, the work of Jews, and those with loftier tendencies were soon subverted into a darker course by Jews. In the case of the struggling young Christianity, for example, the Jews, quick as a flash, began hanging onto its coattails. Consider Paul, properly called Shaul, who was a rabbinical student. The Shaul first chose the Roman-sounding name Saulus, and then he had himself renamed Paulus, and gives cause for thought. No, that he renamed himself to Paulus, that gives cause for thought. Still more, the fact that in the beginning he persecuted the fledgling Christian community with first-rate ferocity. I don't know, mass murderers who later become saints, is that not too much of a marvel? Indeed, the Jew Weinige supposed that Christ had also originally been a criminal. 36 is the footnote. But my God, a Jew could say that 100 times and still not be true on that account. As a Jew, Paul certainly knew that of all the people of the world, the Jews first and foremost needed their souls saved. Go not to the Gentiles, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, demanded Christ, Matthew 10:5-6. Paul ignored it. He went to the Greeks and the Romans and brought them his Christianity, a Christianity with which the Roman Empire became unhinged. All men are equal, brotherhood, pacifism, no more privileges, and the Jew triumphed. I always think, I spun the thread further, of the admirable Herr Levine, that's a Jew, in the Berliner Lokalanzeiger, it's a newspaper. He suddenly burst out one day, as if in rapture, only a Jew could have, with Paul's impudence, put himself in the middle of the capital and there expounded a doctrine which must bring about the utter ruin of the Roman Empire. That's what the man said, word for word. I still remember it perfectly. It certainly hits the nail on the head, he rejoined. It may be a long time yet before Christianity recovers from Paul. Oh, what gullible souls we are. A Jew murders hundreds of Christians. Suddenly he notices that the rest only become even more zealous. The well-known light dawns on him. He pretends to be converted, throws himself into the great pose, and, behold, even though he deviates in nearly all his doctrines from the other apostles, we listen devoutly to his sermons, the simple teachings of the Master, which the most childlike mind might comprehend. We must have explained to us by a Hebrew. The Jew, I replied, certainly must be tempted to say, why are you so stupid that you let everyone make fools of you? And there are many charmers and wizards who, on account of his extraordinary cunning or spirituality, as they call it, look upon him with timid admiration. It depended on mere possessions, he returned. They would be justified. Someone named Goldstein once boasted that the Jews administer the spiritual property of the German people. Footnote 38, a piety he didn't add how they administer it. Well, let us be thankful that there will always be men, for example, who will read Goethe through the eyes of Goethe and not through the slimy spectacles of Goldstein. They may not be professors, but perhaps a vagabond of sort, a breed anyway, which will not become extinct and through which the original Goethe will be safely preserved. The Jews can then quietly administer the new Goethe. It will not be begrudged them. Footnote 39. Suppose, however, I interjected anxiously, the vagabonds also listen credulously to them and fall into the trap. It lies in the nature of the vagabond, Hitler added, to have a heart so full that it matters not how his head happens to be persuaded. It will always be his heart that determines the outcome. They feel intuitively that which the clever, despite their understanding, are not able to see, and they preserve it. One may deceive their heads, but not even they have authority over their spirits. And you see, Hitler pounded the table. They alone are to be thanked that at least part of Christian heritage. And you see, he pounded the table. They alone are to be thanked that at least part of our Christian heritage, as well as our cultural legacy, has survived administration by the Jews. Where are they? Where were they? Among high and low, among the kings and the soldiers, among the popes and the mendicant friars, among the learned and the illiterate elsewhere, but not among the nothing but rich, but not among the nothing but clever, but not among the greedy and the insatiable, but not among the privileged folk. Here the Jew is at home. Wherever he appears here, in the way of the spiritual possessions he matter-of-factly administers, it is his own. Just as everything was transformed into gold for King Midas, every deep and meaningful word is turned into filth by the Jew's touch. But for the others, for the vagabonds of the spirit, I threw to him. Everything remains as of old, he nodded. And by the way, Hitler thought that old schoolhouses in the countryside and farmers were the carriers of German culture because they weren't corrupted by the Jewish subversion in the cities and the towns where the Jews live. Everything remains as of old, he nodded. There have been popes of Jewish blood. Footnote 40. Also, there have seldom or never been a shortage of other dignitaries of the same descent in the church. Was that which they stood for Catholicism? No, it was Judaism. Let's take just one thing. The selling of indulgences, the very essence of the Jewish spirit. We are both Catholics, but dare we not say that? Are we really supposed to believe that there has never been anything in the church with which one can find fault? Just because we are Catholics, we can say it. That has nothing to do with Catholicism. We know that Catholicism would have remained intact even if half of the hierarchy had consisted of Jews. A number of sincere men always held it high, though only secretly, many times even against the Pope. Sometimes there were many such men, sometimes few. So Hitler's saying that certain traditions have been passed on despite Jewish overwhelming corruption because of their spirit. Moving on. The investigation of the Jew and his activities should have been the alpha and the omega of our historians. Instead, they investigate the bowel movements of the past. So he's saying the key mover in history is follow what the Jews have been doing. Don't worry about dates and names. What have the Jews been up to? Figure out what's in the Jewish interest and how they achieved it. Karl the Great favored the Jews at every turn. It seems to me that his slaughter of the 4,500 Saxons at Verdun, the best German blood, and his Jewish advisors had something to do with one another. The notorious insanity of the Crusades bled the German people of 6 million men. Finally, the Hohenstaufen, Friedrich II, succeeded through mere negotiation without striking a blow in securing the Holy Land for Christendom. What did the Curia do? Full of hatred, they hurled the ban of excommunication on Frederick and refused to recognize his treaty with the Sultan, thus neutralizing his great success. It seems that, to those pulling the strings, the incidental bloodletting was more important than the avowed objective of the Crusades. This is just like the wars the Jews get us into. They're designed to kill white men. They were killing a bunch of Christians and Muslims, and they wanted the Gentiles dead. So the crypto Jews in the Catholic Church, even when a German king achieved victory, said, no, your victory through diplomacy isn't valid. Now let's send a bunch of children to die. And you're going to hear about that now. At last came the Children's Crusade. Tens of thousands of children sent against the victorious Turkish army, all to be destroyed. I can't believe that the idea for that absurdity originated in a non-Jewish mind. I am always reminded of the murder of the children of Bethlehem and the slaughter of the Egyptian firstborn. I would give anything for a photograph of the priest who preached that crusade and his flunkies. So in other words, some Jew pretending to be a Christian, some Jew that sprinkled baptismal water on himself, got convinced the German kings after they subverted and destroyed the diplomatic peace and diplomatic victory that the German king had achieved with the Sultan of the Turks. They said, nope, the peace is off, and they sent in a human wave of children. Moving on. Giordano Bruno called the Jews such a pestilential. Giraldo Bruno called the Jews such a pestilential, leprous, and publicly dangerous race that they deserved to be rooted out and destroyed even before their birth. Footnote 41. This genial philosopher was burned at the stake. For his heresy, opponents of the church were swarming in Italy during the time, yet he, the most impartial of them, was seized. So basically, there were a bunch of heretics in Italy against the time that were going against the Catholic Church, but this one guy that said that Jews are bad and should be rooted out of the church was burned at the stake. So the Catholic Church has had a lot of problems with Jewish infiltration. Moving on. Well, how about now? I interrupted him. In Russia, one Catholic priest after another is tortured to death by the Jewish beast. Hundreds have already been liquidated. The Church is taking its last gasp, but Rome cannot bring herself to call the child by its real name. In other words, the Church wouldn't admit that Bolshevism was Jewish, that 85% of the government of the USSR was Jews. Many times she has made a small start in that direction, but only to be immediately squelched. Catholicism wants to speak. Jewry paralyzes its tongue. Rome, he replied, will pull herself together, but only if we pull ourselves together first, and one day it can be said that the Church is whole again. Since those who are responsible for the trouble will have been discovered, I cried, since the disguised Hebrew, together with his cuckoo eggs, will have been thrown out of the Christian community. That is a great reference to the cuckoo, which the cuckoos also rely on crypsis. They enter into a nest, lay parasite eggs that hatch before the indigenous eggs and kick out the indigenous eggs. Since those who are responsible for the trouble will have been discovered, I cried, since the disguised Hebrew, together with his cuckoo eggs, will have been thrown out of the Christian community. He has set not only the Egyptians, but also the Christians against one another, so that they shall fight everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor. And he is still at this game. He works from the outside, carefully building his pitfalls and making his destructive influence felt in the press. But he also works from the inside, where he is even more dangerous in the mask of the Christian minister. The Christian confessions swarm with Jewish and half-Jewish clergymen, the Protestant denominations even more so than the Catholic. They already feel so surely of victory in the Protestant churches that in Dresden, a certain pastor of Waldfisch has the impudence to announce publicly, I am a Jew and will remain one. Yes, now that I have learned the Christian beliefs, I have become more than ever a true Israelite. Footnote 42. And in Hamburg, a preacher named Schwalb said, I consider myself a genuine Jew and have always considered myself thus. Footnote 43. Where that sort of thing is possible, Christianity might as well let itself be buried. Luther's spirit seems to be completely played out among the Protestants. On the question of all questions, the Jewish question, they either hush him completely or try to tone him down. One of the most well-meaning among their theologians, Professor Walter, calls Luther's attitudes towards the Jews so offensive that it might arouse not only confused astonishment among the Christians, but also great indignation among the Jews. Those Christians with a confused astonishment wouldn't have found themselves in that state if they had not previously let themselves be confused by the Jews. And as for the great indignation of the Hebrews, we are not grieved by it. Where, by the way, has that indignation been apparent? So far Israel has been quiet as a mouse about it. They have always praised Luther greatly as the enemy of Rome. Heine became a ceremonious hymn of joy to the reformer with the words, Luther, you dear man. He had good reason, he jeered. All Jews have good reason to celebrate Luther and to ignore his anti-Semitism. Without intending to, he paved the way for them. And how? The more they extol his authority, the less world notices his error. That he later cursed them as a pestilence is indeed bitter to them. But How many people are even aware of his condemnation of the Jews? The Jew Goldman, I put in, stated their reason plainly enough. Luther has again brought the Old Testament to honor. And that is footnote 44. And there's a picture of him, named Goldman, lived from 1894 to 1982. There's a picture of him there. Instead of to dishonor, was the reply. His translation to the German language might have been of some use, as it has grievously damaged the German power of discernment. Lord in heaven, what a halo now surrounds Satan's Bible. Luther's poetry sparkles so that even the incest of Lot's daughters has been given a religious shimmer. Jehovah's commands to be fruitful and multiply had to be obeyed by those two pious maidens at any price. Schopenhauer expressed a similar opinion. I confirmed. He said that if one wants to understand the Old Testament, one must read it in the Greek version. There it has an entirely different tone, an entirely different color, with no presentiment to Christianity. Contrasted with the Greek, Luther's translation seems pious, also often erroneous, indeed sometimes intentionally, and delivered throughout in a churchy, edifying tone. Luther has permitted himself changes which one can call forgeries, and so on. Not Luther, he raised his finger. The rabbis who helped him with the entire translation introduced changes and forgeries. Hebrew is a difficult language. Luther translated a certain word, for example, as racial kinsman, but then the rabbi came in and said the word means neighbor, and so we have the translation love thy neighbor as thyself rather than, as it should be, love thy racial kinsman as thyself. A small piece of cunning, but it served its purpose of giving the Jews the aspect of real humanitarians. Yes, even Luther was taken in by the chosen people, I replied. He looked upon the Old Testament as divine revelation. He approached the book with infatuation, convinced that it could contain nothing but sheer preciousness. Then he began wading into the vile thing. After a few steps, he blinked his eyes, bewildered. He was stunned. That just couldn't be so. It must have some other meaning. And so, with perfectly honest intentions, he read between the lines what simply wasn't there. Everywhere he managed to see allusions to Christ, although nothing could be further from the Jews' actual thoughts on the matter. The Messiah is no lamb's tail, Heine jeered at Christ, no scorner of earthly existence, footnote 46. On the contrary, their Messiah is a brutal dog who will conquer the earth for his Jews. He is the prince of the world. Page after page it says, Ye shall eat the riches of the Gentiles, and in their glory ye shall boast yourselves, or ask me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. One of these is a statement of a divinely inspired prophet, the other a deeply spiritual psalm, Isaiah 61:6, Psalm 2:8. Credulously, Luther viewed everything in a rosy light. This became easy for him when, in the middle of the great morass, he came to passages like, Ye will have no permanent existence among the nations, and the soles of thy feet shall find no rest, and ye will be an abomination among the peoples. Compassion seized him. The Jews, he thought to himself, have become untrue to their godly doctrine, but they will again find their way home to it. It never occurred to him that these direly threatening sermons served only the purpose of holding the Jews to their course. On the other hand, many passages of apparently lofty stamp have quite a different purpose, namely they served as a protective cover. He later recognized this Jewish tactic. He's not referring to Luther here, who translated the Bible into German from Hebrew, the Old Testament, but only in the living Hebrews, not in their Bible. The Jews desire to make all their affairs ambiguous, so that nothing about them is really certain, he said. If one bellabores for them for an especially low-minded passage, they can indignantly point out at one which is dripping with loving kindness. Heine, for example, writes an utterly vulgar poem about Germany. 5 minutes later, he is praising the dear homeland to the skies. A matter of changing mood? Oh, dear God, I suppose that we are to believe that an old street whore often finds herself in the mood to sing Ave Maria, or that a basically honest fellow is often in the mood to steal. What nonsense! No, you are right, Hitler said. The Jew often plays the role of a benefactor only in order to accomplish his destructive aims without notice. It's always been that way. That's ambiguity, I completed. One even finds it in Spinoza. One can hardly imagine a bolder, more outspoken worldview than his, but even his ethics would horrify a pig. In all things seek that which is advantageous, is the quintessence of his moral philosophy, the genuine Jewish viewpoint. And there's an image of Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher that died in 1677 here. I'm going to drop the link to this in the text. We're almost finished here. Drop it a few more times if you wish to read on. I've made a few errors in the reading, but I just plowed through. It is the most terrible tragedy, he said, that Luther bears the responsibility for such a dire development, that consequence of deeds committed in perfect innocence, that today in all civilization is in danger of running aground again. The greatest German, the unsuspecting cause of the German collapse, Luther, the mighty opponent of the Jews, the one who most disastrously paved the way for them. Incomprehensible, I tell you, incomprehensible. To happen too late by a paltry 10 or 20 years, to first become awake to the Jews shortly before his death, when everything had already been determined. Footnote 47. Previously, body and soul for the traitors. Then the Hebrews had still been cousins and brothers of our Lord to him, while the Christians were only brother-in-law and strangers. Wringing his hands, he entered the populace to associate with them in a decent and proper manner. To him, they were exalted above the apostles. The late Erzberger couldn't have carried on more absurdly. Footnote 48. Only not for an instant as sincerely, I stopped him. If Luther had been a contemporary of Erzberger, he wouldn't have had to find out about the purpose of the Jewish hush money first, in order to see through Judaism. As early as his student days, he would have promptly leaped with both feet into the battle against the devil's brood. My God, Hitler immediately resumed, one cannot blame him. A lot has happened in the last 400 years, but there is one thing to remember. Popular instinct was more alert then than nowadays. All along the line, mistrust of the Jews was quite firm. Luther was a man of the people, the son of simple folk. His predilection of many years towards the Jews is a bit misleading. One might take into account a certain naivete, a lack of worldliness, the result of his staying in the cloister. Cloister is like a seminary. The same rule seems to have applied here as elsewhere. Too much studying ruined his vision. Nevertheless, Luther was a great man, a giant. With a shock which pierced the twilight, he saw the Jews as we have only begun to see them today, but unfortunately too late, and even then not there where he had done the most damage, in Christianity. Had he only seen them there, had he only seen them in his youth, then he would not have attacked Catholicism, but rather the Jews behind it. Instead of the wholesale condemnation of the Church, he would have let his whole passionate impetus fall on the true villains. Instead of glorifying the Old Testament, he would have branded it as the arsenal of the Antichrist, and the Jew would have stood there in his abominable nakedness as an eternal warning. He would have been obliged to get out of the Church, out of society, out of the halls of the princes, out of the castles of the knights, and out of the houses of the citizens. For Luther had the strength and the courage and the overpowering will. It would never have come to the splitting of the Church or to the war which, in accordance with the wishes of the Hebrews, spilled Aryan blood in torrents for 30 long years. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. They shall fight every one against his brother and every one against his neighbor, Hitler ground out. What hatred! What demonic hatred! That's not human. What is it? That, my friend, I joked, is the geniality of the heart of which the Jew, Fritz Kahn, has spoken. through which Israel has become the ethical mother of mankind. These fellows are really quaint in their impudence. Khan has called Moses an almost unique phenomenon in the history of civilized peoples, a national hero without weapons. At the same time, he reproves us with the remark that on stormy nights the distressed wail of widows may be heard around the bronze heroes of our marketplaces. That is, around the statues of Prince Eugen, Marshal Blucher, and so on. I wonder what he thinks Moses used to massacre the Egyptian firstborn, if not weapons. Gumdrops, perhaps? Or were they smothered to death from sheer love? Apparently, we are to believe that the Peuple folk consisted entirely of babysitters and wet nurses. Peuple folk is, once again, the poor, dumb Shabbos Goyim, the lower strata of Egypt that carried out the genocide of the firstborns in the name of the Jews, or in the name of fraternity, brotherhood, and equality. Well, all these fellows operate the same way, at least. They don't even bother to deny anything. Instead, they flatly maintain exactly the opposite. The tactic seems to work quite well enough with our men of learning, Hitler growled. The Jews say whatever they please. It is all gospel to our scholars. They wouldn't think of trying to verify anything. The fact that it appears in print is enough for them. A certain Jewess called the Talmuds a grandiose monumental work of the spirit, a heroic monument of ideas to which the millennia have given the breath of their experience. Footnote 49. Immediately upon encountering such a gem, the German professor whips out his notebook, and the next day his students have devoured and digested the new tidbit. That's the way it goes in our gymnasia. That's a plural of gymnasium, the German college preparatory high school. They are all designed, so to say, to turn out nothing but geniuses. Instead, one lackey after another is graduated. A few hours spent browsing in the Talmud, I proceeded, is quite sufficient to remove any doubt about the Jews. It is understandable that they have only the most inordinate praise for that book. When they peep into it, their own peculiar nature peeks back at them. And that, of course, is the greatest source of joy to them. Thus, in essence, every Jew is a Talmudist, even if he has never looked at the Talmud. It makes no difference when it was written. In fact, it needn't have been written at all. The first Jew comprised all its essential ingredients. The Jewish leaders fully understand that, but they only saw it metaphorically. The Talmud is an unimpeachable authority, trumpeted the Rabbi Dr. Grunemann before a Hanover tribunal in 1894. The legal doctrines of the Talmud have precedence, Professor Cohen imperiously told a criminal court in Marburg in 1888, and he added, now pay attention to this, that it all applied to non-believing Jews who, however, were nonetheless still a part of the Jewish community, since they acknowledged the moral doctrines of the Talmud. A masterpiece! From time to time, the fellows blurt out a real secret in their babbling, but we just don't pay attention. In other words, that Jew admitted that Jews are a race and not a religion. That's my insertion there. Whatever it is in the Talmud, we acknowledge to have absolute precedence over the whole law of Moses. A group of so-called Reform Jews testified in Paris in 1860 with the concurrence of the Alliance Israelite. And a rabbi, Dr. Romer, has written in Pierre's Encyclopedia that the Shul Aruch, a kind of Talmud for home use, has been taken on by the Israelitish community, or Jewish community, as an authoritative guide for religious practice. Taken on? Such a wag. Pretty soon I'll be taking on the features of Dietrich Eckart. Lordy said, whoever doesn't become sickened and nauseated upon making a closer acquaintance with the Talmud can put himself on display in a circus sideshow. The local sideshow, I remarked, has certain limits on the degrees of abnormality it will exhibit. The young student from Tübingen, who could gulp down half a dozen toads with a gusto, has been its greatest attraction till now. No one, though, has a stomach capable of digesting even one passage from the Talmud. Rabbi Yohanan said the penis of a Rabbi Ishmael was as large as 6 calves' wineskin. According to others, 3 calves. The penis of Rabbi Papa was as large as one of the baskets of the inhabitants of Harperinia. The high-minded competitive zeal of the 3 old rabbis could knock an unprepared person off his chair. So everything is about dicks and pussies to Jews. One finds a whole series of such pleasantries in this magnificent example of a religious book, he said disgustedly. The real censure, however, is that non-Jewish girls who are less than 3 years and 1 day old are considered suitable for rabbis, since Moses had written, "But all the women, children who have not known a man by lying with him keep alive for yourselves," namely for the rabbis, footnote 52. The most abominable perversity and the most tedious syllable thrashing in the same breath. What goes on within Jewish heads must really be frightful. And so this is basically Hitler saying Jews are pedophiles, which is absolutely true. Jews rape kids. I flew a blimp to that. God, I gotta get back out there and name the Jew again. Hitler's got me all fired up. Moving on, I returned, are of a contrary opinion on that. Otherwise, they're a mirror image. The Talmud wouldn't inform us that the Israelites are more pleasing before God than the angels, footnote 53, or that the world was created on behalf of the Israelites alone, or that whoever slaps a Jew in the face has struck God himself, or that the sun illuminates the earth and the rain makes it fertile only because Israelites live on it, and more of that same sort of modesty. I really doubt that there is any sort of medical encyclopedia which contains terms suitable for describing Jewish megalomania, he said. But what an incredible talent they have for disguising it. Megalomania is just like stealing everything. No, hold on. That's kleptomania. Megalomania is to be egomaniacal. My bad. Their book, Sirach, I completed, howls. Terrify all people. Lift your hand up against strangers, that they may see your power. The fire of wrath must burn them. Crush the heads of the princes who are our enemies. That's from Sirach 36, 2-12. And the Shulchan Aruch rages, pour out, O Lord, your fury over the Goyim, who do not know you, over the kingdoms which do not invoke your name. Pursue them in wrath and extinguish them beneath God's heaven. That is Shulchan Aruch Gaim 480. They make the same threat in both places, with the distinction that the Shulchan Aruch emphasizes that all must be exterminated who do not swear on Jehovah. And with such abominable moral doctrines on his conscience, he began to boil. That marvel of modern Jewry, Moses Mendelssohn, footnote 54, had the impudence to assert that dominion over the earth belongs by right to the Jewry. Because of their religion, as a trained Talmudist, he certainly knew his way around the whole vile thing. Those extracts we have just quoted are only a tiny fraction, but he still, this lying, this utterly mendacious pact, the very essence of the lie. All Berlin, I said, buzzed with praise for the wise, for the noble Moses, but Goethe wasn't deceived. Jewish trivia was his comment on the pious trickery. It struck no one as odd that the incomparable Moses philosophized himself in the twinkling of an eye from a simple private tutor to the powerfully wealthy founder of a banking house of Mendelssohn, thus avoided by a wide detour the eye of the needle. This benefactor of mankind slowly promoted the idea that the Jewish people constitute a religious community only. Today, this still constitutes a favorite nostrum of the Jews. A certain Dr. Rupin has revealed why special laws against the Jews, he tells us as he chuckles and rubs his hands together, have always been directed against the religious aspects of Jewry, since the sphere of activity provided the only easily conceivable target for legislation. Anti-Semitism has never really been inimical to the Jewish religion, but has been indifferent to it, footnote 55. So we now have an admission that their religion serves a very useful diversionary purpose. Anyone, however, who has become acquainted with it has found out what the Jews call their religion coincides exactly with their character. That's what they themselves say, Hitler said. They are incessantly boasting, too, that their religion is such a masterful creation that it stands alone in the world. Then bring the Talmud forward. It contains the Jewish religion in its purest form, theology, dogmatics, morality, everything together in the same place. Why do they hold back the magnificent book so nervously, if indeed the millennia have given the breath of its existence to it? As born benefactors of mankind, they should have long since made it accessible to the general populace. Instead, it still hasn't been completely translated even today. And who the devil has read what there is of it? One would think they are afraid some medieval church is still waiting to burn it for heresy. Some religion. This wallowing in filth, this hate, this malice, this arrogance, this hypocrisy, this pettifogging, this incitement to deceit and murder. Is that a religion? Then there has never been any more religious than the devil himself. It is a Jewish essence, the Jewish character, period, the devil. Luther, I interjected, expressed his opinion of it plainly enough. He urges us to burn the synagogues and the Jewish schools and to heap earth on its remains, so that no man would ever again see one stone or cinder of them. God would forgive us for what we formerly had tolerated through our ignorance. I hadn't known it myself, he wrote, but now they were aware of what went on. We dared not at any price protect these buildings wherein they slander, curse, spit on, and revile both Christ and us. We could hardly speak more strongly ourselves. He also urged the destruction of their houses, for they carried on there the same way as in their schools. Some may feel, he complained, that my judgment is too harsh. It is, if anything, too lenient, for I have seen their writings. 56 is the footnote. Our school inspectors apparently haven't seen them, nor have our charmers or wizards. Burning their synagogues, I am afraid, would have been a little avail, Hitler shrugged. Even if there had never been a synagogue or a Jewish school, an Old Testament, a Talmud, the Jewish spirit would still have been there and had its effect. It has always been there. Every Jew ever born has embodied it, and that is even more pronounced with the so-called enlightened Jews. Heine belonged certainly among the most enlightened, but he had just as much insane arrogance as the greasiest Galician kike. Moses Mendelssohn passed for a downright wonder of wisdom, yet, lo and behold, he found it actually shocking that the Jews still didn't have the dominion over the earth which was due to them. Footnote 57, Moses Mendelssohn. From long years of experience, I brought out, Dostoevsky depicted the hair-raising conceit of the Russian Jew. Footnote 58. For a long time, he lived with all kinds of convicts, including several Jews, sleeping on the same wooden bunks with them. Everyone treated these Jews in a friendly manner. He reported not even taking offense at their raving mad manner of praying. Probably their own religion had once been like that, thought the Russians to themselves, and they quietly let the Jews do as they pleased. But on the other hand, the Jews hotly rejected the Russians, didn't want to eat with them, and even looked down on them. And where was this? In a Siberian prison? All over Russia, Dostoevsky found this antipathy and loathing of the Jews for the natives. Now, however, did the Russian people resent their behavior, indulgently believing it to be part of the Jewish religion. And there's a picture of Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1881. Yes, indeed, and what a religion, he said scornfully. It is the character of a people which determines the nature of their religion, not the other way around. So that's the thing. Jews formulated Judaism because they're fucking sick. Judaism is fucking sick. What the genocides of the Old Testament are fucking sick, and the Talmud is even sicker, and it is a reflection of the Jewish soul. Jews are gonna Jew, whether they have a piece of paper or not. Dostoevsky, I continued, was compassion itself, but Dostoevsky, I continued, was compassion itself, but like Christ, he took exception to the Jews with foreboding. He asked what would happen in Russia if the Jews ever should get the upper hand there. Would they even approximately give their natives the same rights they themselves enjoyed? Would they likewise allow them to pray in the manner they wished, or would they not simply make slaves of them? Still worse, wouldn't they skin and fleece them? Wouldn't they even exterminate them, as they have so often done with other peoples in their history? And that's funny, because it's exactly what the fucking Jews did when they took over Russia. They killed 60 million fucking people! Could our workers... moving on here, the quote is, could our workers but share his foreboding, Dostoevsky's foreboding about the Jews, particularly those who hope for salvation from the Soviets, he cried. Famine, mass grave, slavery, Jewish whips. Whoever goes on strike is hanged. Come, Hitler, all ye who are weary and heavy laden. How they whistle, the dogs, and how fine that sounds in front of the curtain. Behind it, however, lurk a pampered Purplefolk, the Red Army, the dregs of the non-Jewish humanity. The toll of the Russian sacrifice since the beginning of the Bolshevik domination is estimated by the authorities at about 30 million, I answered. Those who weren't, and this was in 1923, the blood kept on flowing long after that. These fucking kikes are murderers. They're going to do it to us here too. Are you going to let them do that? Are you going to let the Jews slaughter you? Will you stand up and will you oppose these murderous fucking kikes before they do to us what they've done to thousands of other countries? Wake up! Moving on. Those who weren't summarily executed fell to famine and disease. Were they all bourgeois? Only an imbecile could believe that. Who among us, then, has the most to suffer? The thousands who every day stand for long hours at their various occupation. Capitalists are hardly a majority among them, but that hasn't dawned on our workers. In their eagerness to be the masters, they let themselves be led about by the nose like children by these Jews. Next quote, Abert, footnote 59, has thundered against capitalism his whole life. Now he is president, and at every street corner banks sprout from the ground like mushrooms. That is certainly a fact. Everyone sees it. Anyone can reach out and touch it. But does that lead anyone to smell a rat? Not on your life. The first thing the Jew Eisner, footnote 60, did after the revolution was have the banks guarded by the army. Capitalists smuggled their enormous hoards of money out of the country for months, and he didn't raise a finger to stop them. He felt it was more important to travel to the Socialist Congress in Switzerland, and there place the entire guilt for the World War on Germany. Do penance, he said, and the French will forgivingly clasp you to their hearts. Quite likely, experience has gloriously confirmed that. The same Eisner, he noted, who at the beginning of the war sent a flood of telegrams to the other Social Democrat leaders entreating them to remain true to the Kaiser. A disgraceful stab in the back must be avoided at all costs, said he. It went like that until the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It went like that until the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Up until then, all German Jews were inspired monarchists. But then came the about-face. The Moor had done his duty and crushed the Tsarist Russia. Now for him to crush himself. The rest is silence, visible to all eyes. The Jew also made his bid in Germany. O workers, to let yourselves be thus deceived. Things are different than which innocents let themselves dream. The Communist Party in Germany still has fewer than 250,000 members, yet it owns over 50 newspapers. What that cost is simply incalculable. Millions. Who pays these enormous sums? We National Socialists have our hands full just keeping our one Beobachter going. That's the name of the National Socialist newspaper. They could barely afford to keep one newspaper going. If we had an arrangement with the Jews, we would have a prodigious number of party newspapers in an instant. Are there comrades who doubt that? I'd like to meet one. And look, this is the incredible thing. They know that the Jews are secretly behind things, but they act as if they weren't so at all. Is that honest? Can that lead to a happy outcome? To rush to destruction unsuspectingly is one thing, but to do it knowingly and to single out one's grimmest enemy as an accomplice is another. I'd like to know, I remarked, what comrades would say if one proved that to them in black and white that the Junkers or the big industrialists have had a secret moral philosophy of the most abominable sort since the time immemorial. Their rage would be unimaginable. Aha! Everyone would roar. With principles like that, it is no wonder the devils torment us so. Imagine that. How can anyone be that mean and vile? The whole bunch of them should be exterminated. That would carry on like that, as if possessed, and righteously so. But on the other hand, when one shows them that the Jews have, in their official religious books, the most hair-raising statements about the plundering and murder of all Gentiles, it makes no difference at all to them. They either dispute it, or when that seems hopeless, say most Jews haven't been that religious for a long time, and don't concern themselves with that stuff anymore. It never occurs to them that the Jewish character is the source of their vile literature. But this, Hitler said, tops it all. And I mean social injustices of any significance in the world today can be traced back to the subterranean influence of the Jews. The workers seek, therefore, to eliminate, with the help of the Jews, those evils which none other than the Jews themselves have consciously and deliberately established. One can imagine what kind of help they will receive. Behold the modest Joseph, I rejoined. His influence on the Pharaoh caused the Egyptians dreadful distress, from which they later thought they would free themselves with the help of Moses. I must admit that the episode does not lack a certain grim humor. The truth, Hitler said, is indeed, as you once wrote, one can only understand the Jew when one knows what his ultimate goal is, and that goal is, beyond world domination, the annihilation of the world. He must wear down all the rest of mankind. He persuades himself in order to prepare a paradise on earth. He made himself believe that only he is capable of this great task, and considering his ideas of paradise, that is certainly so. But one sees if only in the means which he employs, that he is secretly driven to something else. When he pretends to himself to be elevating mankind, he torments men to despair, to madness, to ruin. If a halt is not ordered, he will destroy all men. His nature compels him to that goal, even though he dimly realizes that he must thereby destroy himself. There is no other way for him. He must act thusly. This realization of the unconditional dependence of his own existence upon that of his victims appears to me to be the main cause of his hatred, to be obliged to try and annihilate us all with all his might, but at the same time to suspect that must lead inevitably to his own ruin. Therein lies, if you will, the tragedy of Lucifer. He ended by calling the Jews self-destructive devils, and they were. I will be doing a lot more stuff based on theological teachings. I have been studying what the Jews tried to do to early Christianity, and they tried to weaponize Christianity and destroy Rome with it. Ravello P. Oliver is clutch. You have to understand that. And the Jews today are trying to remove the Greco-Roman moralistic, logical and moral parts of the Bible, the things that were incorporated in the Council of Nicaea that made it European-friendly, that reflected our morals and not just the genocidal intentions of the Jews. The things that make the Bible great are the things in it that are European. These are the things the Jews are trying to rout out now through their new control of the Zionist churches. But that's going to be it for the night. I just read for, I think, 3 hours straight. So have a good night, Goyim. And remember, the Jews want to kill every single one of you. The Jews are our misfortune. Good night.